Picture this. You're standing on a cliff overlooking the deep blue Aegean Sea, watching the sun paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. Below you, the remnants of what was once one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history lie buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and time. This isn't just another archaeological site. This is Thera, modern-day Santorini. And what happened here over 3,500 years ago was so catastrophic, so earth-shattering that it may have inspired the legend of Atlantis itself. But here's what makes this story truly incredible. The people who lived here didn't just build a city near a volcano. They worshipped it. They built their entire civilization around it. And when it finally erupted, it unleashed one of the most powerful explosions in recorded human history, burying their world so completely that we're only now beginning to understand what we lost. I'm about to take you on a journey back in time to explore a civilization that was so advanced, so sophisticated, that when archaeologists first uncovered it, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. We're talking about indoor plumbing, 3-story buildings, art so beautiful it takes your breath away, and a society that thrived for over 1,000 years before vanishing in a single apocalyptic moment. Now, I've spent months researching this story, digging through archaeological reports, talking to experts, and piecing together evidence from sites across the Mediterranean. What I discovered isn't just the story of one lost city. It's a tale that connects ancient Egypt, the palaces of Crete, and possibly even the biblical plagues of Exodus. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some scholars believe this eruption didn't just destroy a civilization, it changed the course of human history. But first, let me paint you a picture of what this place was like when it was alive, when it was breathing, when it was home to people who had no idea they were living on borrowed time. The year is roughly 1600 BCE. The Bronze Age is in full swing, and the Mediterranean is a bustling highway of trade and cultural exchange. Egypt is at the height of its new kingdom power, building monuments that still leave us speechless today. The Minoan civilization on Crete has created palaces so elaborate they'll inspire legends of labyrinths and monsters for millennia to come. And nestled in the heart of the Aegean Sea sits a circular island called Strong Isle, meaning the round one. This island isn't just any piece of land. It's actually the rim of a massive volcanic caldera, a sleeping giant that's been dormant for so long that the people living on it have forgotten it was ever dangerous. The soil here is incredibly fertile, fed by centuries of volcanic ash, and the natural harbors created by the caldera's shape make it a perfect stopping point for merchants traveling between Egypt, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland. But what really sets this place apart isn't its geography. It's the people who call it home. The Therans, as we call them now, have built something remarkable here. Their main settlement, which archaeologists have named Akrotiri after the modern village nearby, is unlike anything else from this period. We're not talking about a collection of mud huts or even the stone buildings you might expect from the Bronze Age. These people have created a genuine urban center, complete with multi-story buildings, sophisticated drainage systems, and art that rivals anything produced in the ancient world. Walking through the streets of Akrotiri in its heyday, would have been like stepping into a time machine that jumped forward 2,000 years. The buildings rise 3 and sometimes 4 stories high, their walls decorated with frescoes so vibrant and detailed that they seem to pulse with life. There are scenes of young men boxing, their bodies captured in perfect athletic motion. There are dolphins leaping through azure waters, their forms so realistic you can almost hear the splash. There are processions of women in elaborate dress, their faces serene and confident, carrying flowers and sacred objects in religious ceremonies that we can only begin to understand. The level of sophistication here is staggering. These aren't primitive people scratching out a living on a remote island. These are cosmopolitan citizens of a Bronze Age metropolis. Their houses have running water, with terracotta pipes carrying fresh water from mountain springs and wastewater away through an elaborate sewage system. The ground floors of their buildings are often used for storage and workshops, with massive ceramic jars called pithoi standing ready to hold grain, oil, and wine. The upper floors are living spaces with windows that let in light and air and walls covered in plaster painted with scenes that tell us stories about their daily lives, their beliefs, and their dreams. And everywhere you look, there's evidence of wealth and trade. Pottery from Crete sits alongside vessels from the Greek mainland and Egypt. Gold jewelry crafted with techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern workshop gleams in storage boxes. Weights and measures from a dozen different trading systems suggest that merchants from across the known world regularly did business here. But perhaps most fascinating of all are the religious artifacts. Because while the Therans clearly traded with Egypt and Crete, their spiritual life seems to have been uniquely their own. And at the center of it all, dominating not just the landscape, but apparently their entire worldview, is the volcano itself. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because the relationship between the Therans and their volcano is unlike anything we see in other ancient cultures. Most civilizations that live near active volcanoes develop myths and rituals designed to appease these dangerous forces of nature. They tell stories about angry gods who need to be placated with sacrifices. They create elaborate ceremonies to ward off eruptions. The Therans did something different. They embraced their volcano. Look at their art and you'll see what I mean. The famous spring fresco from Akrotiri doesn't show people cowering in fear of natural forces. Instead, it depicts a landscape transformed by volcanic activity into something beautiful and life-giving. Swallows dart between lily-covered cliffs that are clearly volcanic in origin. The entire scene celebrates the power of the earth to create as well as destroy. In the fisherman fresco, a young man holds strings of fish with a confidence that suggests the sea around their volcanic island provides abundance, not danger. His expression is serene, almost proud. There's no hint of fear, no suggestion that he's living under the shadow of doom. Even more telling are the religious ceremonies depicted in their art. The famous saffron gatherers fresco shows women and girls collecting saffron flowers, which grow particularly well in volcanic soil. These aren't desperate offerings to appease an angry god. These are celebrations of the bounty that their unique environment provides. The more you study Theran art and artifacts, the more you realize that these people didn't see their volcano as a threat to be feared. They saw it as the source of their prosperity, the foundation of their entire way of life. The fertile soil that fed their crops, the obsidian glass that they could trade for luxury goods, the natural harbors that made them wealthy merchants, even the unique beauty of their landscape that attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. All of it flowed from the geological forces that had shaped their island home. In a very real sense, they had built a civilization that worshipped the volcano, not through fear but through gratitude. This perspective shaped everything about Theran society. Their architecture took advantage of the island's unique topography, with buildings carved into volcanic cliffs and designed to withstand the minor earthquakes that periodically shook the ground. Their economy was built around products that only a volcanic environment could provide. From the obsidian tools they exported to the distinctive pottery they created using local volcanic clay. Even their social structure seems to have been influenced by their environment. Unlike the rigid hierarchies we see in other Bronze Age civilizations, Theran society appears to have been remarkably egalitarian. The houses in Akrotiri, while varying in size, all show similar levels of comfort and decoration. There are no massive palaces dominating humble dwellings, no clear divisions between rich and poor quarters. It's almost as if living in such a unique and potentially dangerous environment had taught them that they were all in it together, that their survival depended not on individual dominance but on collective cooperation and shared prosperity. And for over 1,000 years, this philosophy worked brilliantly. The Therans became some of the most successful traders in the Mediterranean world. Their influence can be traced from Egypt to Anatolia, from Crete to the Greek mainland. They developed artistic styles that influenced cultures across the region. They created technologies and techniques that would be copied for centuries. They had built what might genuinely be called a paradise. But paradises, as we know from countless stories throughout history, are fragile things. And the very force that had created their prosperity, that had shaped their landscape and their culture and their entire way of life, was about to remind them of something they had forgotten in their centuries of success. Volcanoes don't stay dormant forever. The first signs that something was changing probably seemed insignificant at first. A slight increase in the frequency of small earthquakes, perhaps. A subtle shift in the color or temperature of the hot springs that dotted the island. Maybe some of the older residents, the ones whose grandparents still remembered stories from generations past, began to feel uneasy. But for the most part, life in Akrotiri continued as it always had. Merchants arrived from distant lands bringing news and goods from across the Mediterranean. Artisans worked in their studios creating pottery and frescoes that would have been treasured in any Bronze Age palace. Children played in streets that had echoed with laughter for generations. None of them could have imagined that they were living through the final chapter of their civilization's story. The warning signs, when they finally came, arrived like whispers before a scream. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the months leading up to the catastrophic eruption, the Therans began to notice changes that their ancestors might have recognized, but that they, in their prosperity and confidence, initially dismissed. The ground trembled more frequently, but these were people who had lived with minor earthquakes their entire lives. The hot springs that fed their sophisticated plumbing systems grew warmer, but volcanic islands always had thermal activity. What's remarkable is that when we excavate the final layers of Akrotiri, we don't find evidence of panic or chaos. We find something far more telling. We find preparation. The Therans weren't caught completely off guard. They had time to recognize that something unprecedented was happening. And their response reveals just how sophisticated their society had become. Instead of fleeing in terror or desperately trying to appease angry gods, they organized what appears to have been one of the most systematic evacuations in ancient history. When archaeologists first began uncovering Akrotiri in the 1960s, they made a discovery that puzzled them for years. Here was a Bronze Age city buried under meters of volcanic ash, perfectly preserved like a Mediterranean Pompeii. But unlike Pompeii, where excavators found the remains of people caught in their final moments, Akrotiri was empty. Not empty of possessions, not empty of evidence of life, but empty of people. At first, some scholars suggested that perhaps the inhabitants had simply been completely obliterated by the eruption, their remains scattered by the violence of the explosion. But as the excavation continued, a different picture emerged. This wasn't a city caught unaware. This was a city that had been systematically abandoned. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Storage jars that would normally have been filled with precious oils and grains stand empty. Valuable bronze tools and weapons are missing from workshops where you'd expect to find them. Most tellingly, there's virtually no jewelry, no gold, no precious objects of the kind that people would never willingly leave behind. The Therans had time to pack. They had time to organize. They had time to save not just their lives, but their most treasured possessions. But they couldn't save their city. What happened next was an explosion so powerful that it literally reshaped the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean. The volcano that had been the foundation of Theran prosperity became the instrument of its complete annihilation. Modern volcanologists estimate that the Thera eruption released energy equivalent to several hundred atomic bombs. The explosion was so violent that it blew out the center of the island, collapsing what had been a roughly circular landmass into the distinctive crescent shape that we know today as Santorini. Where once there had been a prosperous city built around a natural harbor, there was now a massive underwater crater, or caldera, nearly 10 miles across and over 1,000 feet deep. The immediate destruction was total and instantaneous. Akrotiri and every other settlement on the island were buried under layers of pumice and ash that in some places reached depths of over 200 feet. The fertile fields that had fed the Theran economy vanished beneath a gray wasteland. The sophisticated harbor that had welcomed merchants from across the Mediterranean was obliterated, replaced by churning seas that would remain dangerous for decades. But the destruction didn't stop at the shores of Thera. The explosion sent a column of ash and debris nearly 25 miles into the atmosphere. Winds carried this volcanic material across hundreds of miles, blanketing the eastern Mediterranean in a gray shroud that blocked out the sun. Archaeological evidence of Thera and ash has been found on Crete, on the Turkish coast in Egypt, and even as far away as the Black Sea. And then came the tsunamis. When that much land collapses into the sea that quickly, the water has nowhere to go but up and out. The waves generated by the Thera eruption would have been unlike anything in recorded human history, towering walls of water that raced across the Mediterranean at hundreds of miles per hour. These weren't the kind of tsunamis we might see from modern earthquakes. Dangerous but localized events that affect specific coastlines. These were region-wide catastrophes that would have struck every shore in the eastern Mediterranean within hours of the initial explosion. Imagine being a fisherman on the coast of Crete, going about your normal daily routine, when suddenly the sea begins to behave in ways you've never seen before. First, it retreats, pulling back from the shore farther than the lowest tide, exposing the sea floor for hundreds of yards. Fish flop desperately in pools left behind. Boats that were floating moments before now sit stranded on wet sand. And then, on the horizon, you see it, a dark line that at first looks like a distant storm cloud, but it's moving wrong, moving too fast. And as it gets closer, you realize it's not a cloud at all. It's water, a wall of water taller than the highest building you've ever seen, racing toward shore with the speed of a galloping horse. There would have been no escape, no time to run, no high ground to reach, no warning system to alert coastal communities. The tsunamis struck with devastating force, penetrating miles inland, destroying everything in their path. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of sudden, widespread devastation across the region. Minoan palaces on Crete, which had been the most sophisticated civilization in the Mediterranean, show evidence of massive destruction around this time. Coastal settlements throughout the Greek islands simply vanish from the archaeological record. Even in Egypt, hundreds of miles away, there are hints in ancient texts of a period of darkness and chaos that some scholars have connected to the Thera eruption. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. The destruction of Thera didn't just end one civilization. It may have triggered a cascade of changes that reshaped the entire ancient world. The Minoan civilization on Crete, which had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, never fully recovered from the devastation. This created a power vacuum that allowed other cultures, particularly the Mycenaean Greeks, to rise to prominence. The disruption of trade networks forced communities across the region to develop new economic relationships, new political alliances, new ways of organizing their societies. Some scholars even argue that the chaos caused by the Thera eruption contributed to events recorded in the Bible. The timing roughly corresponds with the estimated period of the Exodus from Egypt, and some of the plagues described in that story. Darkness covering the land, water turning to blood, massive storms and destruction, bear striking similarities to what we might expect from a massive volcanic eruption hundreds of miles away. Whether or not you accept these more speculative connections, there's no doubt that the destruction of Thera marked the end of an era in Mediterranean history. The Bronze Age world that had existed before the eruption was gone forever, replaced by new civilizations, new power structures, new ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world. And what of the Therans themselves, the people who had built their paradise around a sleeping volcano? The ones who had managed to escape their doomed island carried with them not just their lives and their possessions, but their memories, their stories, their understanding of what they had lost. These refugees scattered across the Mediterranean, settling in communities from Egypt to Anatolia, from Crete to the Greek mainland. They brought with them artistic techniques, technological knowledge, and cultural practices that would influence their new homes for generations. But they also brought something else. The memory of a great civilization that had vanished beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day. Is it any wonder that centuries later, when the Greek philosopher Plato wanted to tell a story about the dangers of hubris and the fragility of human achievement, he wrote about Atlantis, a great island civilization that had been swallowed by the sea? The details don't match exactly, but the emotional truth is unmistakable. Somewhere in the collective memory of the ancient world was the knowledge that such things could happen, that entire civilizations could disappear, that paradise could become hell in the space of a single day. The story of Thera forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own relationship with the forces of nature that shape our world. The Therans had lived for over a millennium believing they had found the secret to harmony with nature. They had built a society that didn't just tolerate the geological forces around them, but celebrated them, incorporated them, made them the foundation of everything they valued. Their art glorified the volcanic landscape. Their economy depended on volcanic products. Their entire worldview was shaped by the belief that they had learned to live in partnership with the earth itself, and in many ways they were right. For 1,000 years, that partnership had brought them unprecedented prosperity. They had created one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age, a society that in many ways wouldn't be out of place in the modern world. They had indoor plumbing when most of Europe was still living in huts. They had 3-story buildings when other cultures were barely managing stone foundations. They had created art so beautiful, so sophisticated, that when we look at it today, we feel an immediate connection across the millennia. But there's a dark lesson hidden in their success. And it's one that we're still struggling to learn today. The problem with building a civilization around natural forces is that nature operates on timescales that dwarf human memory. What seems like a permanent feature of the landscape to us might be just a brief pause in geological terms. The Therans had lived through perhaps 50 generations of prosperity, long enough that the very idea of catastrophic volcanic activity had faded from their collective consciousness. They knew they lived on a volcano, but it had been dormant for so long that it had become part of the background, like the color of the sky or the taste of water. This is what geologists call the disaster gap, the period between major events that's long enough for people to forget that such events are possible. We see it everywhere in the modern world. Cities built on earthquake faults, communities constructed in floodplains, coastal developments that ignore the reality of rising seas and hurricane damage. The Therans weren't naive or foolish. They were human, with all the limitations that come with human timescales and human memory. And when the Earth finally reminded them of its power, the reminder was absolute. But here's what makes the Theran story so compelling and so relevant to us today. Even in the face of unprecedented catastrophe, these people managed to respond with remarkable sophistication. The systematic evacuation of Akrotiri suggests a level of social organization, of communication, of collective decision-making that rivals anything we might see in a modern emergency. Think about what this means. Somehow, the Therans recognized that the minor earthquakes and thermal changes they were experiencing weren't just another phase of normal volcanic activity. They understood that something unprecedented was happening, something that required unprecedented action. And instead of panicking, instead of fragmenting into competing groups, each looking out for themselves, they came together and organized what may have been the most successful mass evacuation in ancient history. How did they do it? How did a Bronze Age society without modern communication systems, without weather monitoring equipment, without any of the tools we consider essential for disaster management, manage to coordinate the movement of an entire population off an island before it exploded? The answer, I think, lies in the very thing that made them vulnerable in the first place: their intimate relationship with their environment. These weren't people who lived apart from nature, insulated by technology and urban planning from the geological forces around them. They were people who had built their entire civilization around understanding and responding to their volcanic environment. They knew the rhythms of their island the way a sailor knows the sea, the way a farmer knows the soil. They had spent 1,000 years learning to read the subtle signs that the earth provides. When those signs changed, when the familiar patterns of seismic activity and thermal variation began to shift in ways their ancestors might have recognized but they had never seen, they had the wisdom to listen. They had the social structures in place to act. And they had the collective memory buried deep in their cultural practices and religious ceremonies of what it meant to live in partnership with forces larger than themselves. The evacuation of Akrotiri wasn't just a logistical achievement, it was a spiritual one. It represented the moment when an entire civilization looked at the thing they had worshipped, the volcano that had given them everything, and recognized that it was about to take everything away. And instead of fighting that recognition, instead of denying it or trying to bargain with it, they accepted it and acted accordingly. It's a deboulement. Of course, acceptance couldn't save their city. Nothing could save their city. When the eruption finally came, it was so powerful that it literally erased Thera from the map, replacing a thriving island civilization with a water-filled crater surrounded by scattered remnants of land. The physical destruction was so complete that for over 3,000 years, the very existence of Akrotiri was nothing more than a local legend. Stories told by fishermen about ruins they sometimes glimpsed beneath the waves. But the people survived. The Therans who had fled their doomed island carried with them something more precious than the gold and bronze they had managed to salvage. They carried their knowledge, their skills, their understanding of how to build a sophisticated society. They carried their artistic traditions, their technological innovations, their social practices. Most importantly, they carried their story. And that story, The memory of a great civilization that had risen from volcanic soil and ultimately been claimed by volcanic fire became part of the larger narrative of the ancient Mediterranean world. It influenced how later cultures understood the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. It shaped artistic traditions, religious practices, and philosophical thought in ways that we're still discovering. When we look at the frescoes that survived in the buried city of Akrotiri, we're not just looking at Bronze Age art. We're looking at the last testament of a people who understood something that we're still trying to learn: that the forces that create can also destroy. That the things we depend on most are often the things that pose the greatest risk. And that true civilization isn't about conquering nature, but about finding ways to live gracefully within natural systems that are ultimately beyond our control. The Thera eruption changed everything. Not just for the people who lived through it, but for everyone who came after. It marked the end of the Bronze Age Mediterranean world, and the beginning of something new, something different, something that would eventually evolve into the classical civilizations we know from history books. The Minoans never recovered their former glory. The Mycenaeans rose to fill the power vacuum. Trade routes shifted, political alliances reformed, cultural practices evolved. But perhaps most significantly, the eruption changed how people thought about their place in the world. The Bronze Age had been an era of unprecedented human achievement, a time when it seemed like civilization could overcome any challenge, could build cities anywhere, could harness any natural resource. The destruction of Thera served as a brutal reminder that no matter how advanced we become, no matter how sophisticated our technology or how elaborate our cities, we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our understanding or control. This lesson echoes through the centuries. You can hear it in the Greek myths about hubris and nemesis, in the Roman understanding of fortune's wheel, in the biblical stories of pride going before a fall. The memory of Thera, transformed and mythologized but still recognizable, became part of humanity's collective wisdom about the dangers of forgetting our limitations. And yet the story of Thera isn't ultimately about limitation. It's about resilience. It's about the remarkable capacity of human beings to adapt, to survive, to rebuild, to carry forward what matters most, even in the face of absolute catastrophe. The Therans who survived the eruption didn't just preserve their lives. They preserved their culture, their knowledge, their understanding of how to create beauty and meaning in an uncertain world. They took the skills they had developed over a millennium of island life and applied them in new contexts, in new environments, contributing to the civilizations that would eventually give us philosophy and democracy and literature and science. In a very real sense, we are all inheritors of Thera. Not just because the eruption helped shape the world that produced Western civilization, but because the Theran story encapsulates something essential about the human experience. We build our lives and our societies around forces we don't fully understand. We create meaning and beauty and prosperity in the shadow of uncertainty. We learn to love the very things that might ultimately destroy us. And when catastrophe comes, as it inevitably does, we discover what we're really made of. We discover whether we have the wisdom to recognize when the world is changing, the courage to act on that recognition, and the resilience to carry forward what matters most when everything familiar is swept away. The buried city of Akrotiri stands today as a monument to all of these discoveries. Walking through its excavated streets, looking at its preserved frescoes, touching its ancient stones, you're not just encountering the past. You're encountering a mirror that reflects our own relationship with the forces that shape our world. The ruins whisper questions that we're still learning how to answer. As you stand among the reconstructed walls of Akrotiri today, breathing the same Mediterranean air that once filled Theran lungs, you can't help but wonder what they saw in those final months. What did the smoke look like as it began to rise more frequently from the crater? What did the ground feel like beneath their feet as the tremors grew stronger? What conversations took place in these very rooms as families made the impossible decision to abandon everything they had ever known? The archaeological evidence gives us fragments of those final days, tantalizing glimpses into how a civilization faces its own extinction. In one house, excavators found a large storage jar positioned near the door, as if someone had been in the process of moving it when they were forced to flee. In another building, they discovered tools laid out in careful rows, organized as if the craftsman intended to return and finish his work. These aren't the chaotic remnants of panic. These are the methodical preparations of people who understood they were leaving forever but refused to let that understanding rob them of their dignity. But perhaps the most haunting discovery of all was found in what archaeologists call the House of the Ladies. Here, in a room decorated with some of the most beautiful frescoes ever created, someone had carefully stacked wooden furniture against the walls and covered everything with cloth. It wasn't an attempt to save these possessions from the coming disaster. It was an act of respect, a final gesture of care for objects that had been part of daily life for generations. Someone took the time in those last desperate days to say goodbye properly. This attention to ritual and ceremony in the face of catastrophe tells us something profound about Theran culture. These weren't people who had simply built a successful trading civilization. They had created a society that understood the importance of meaning, of symbolism, of maintaining human dignity even when the world itself was ending. The same impulse that had led them to cover their walls with beautiful art, to develop sophisticated religious ceremonies, to create objects of lasting beauty even for everyday use. This same impulse guided them as they prepared to leave their home forever. And leave they did, carrying with them not just their portable wealth, but their knowledge, their skills, and most importantly, their stories. When we trace the influence of Theran culture through the archaeological record of the following centuries, we find their fingerprints everywhere. Pottery techniques that had been developed on the island appear in distant settlements. Artistic motifs that had decorated Theran walls show up in Cretan palaces and Egyptian tombs. Religious symbols that had been carved into Theran stones begin appearing in sanctuaries across the Mediterranean. The refugees didn't just survive, they transformed the world they entered. But this transformation came at a cost that goes beyond anything we can measure in archaeological artifacts or artistic influences. When the Therans scattered across the Mediterranean, they carried with them the memory of loss on a scale that defied comprehension. They had watched their entire world disappear, not gradually through war or economic decline, but instantaneously through forces so powerful that human language struggles to describe them. Imagine trying to explain to your children born in exile what their homeland had been like. How do you convey the beauty of morning light on volcanic cliffs to someone who has never seen volcanic cliffs? How do you describe the sound of wind through the natural arches that connected different parts of the island to someone who has never experienced that particular geography? How do you maintain the memory of religious ceremonies that were intimately connected to landscape features that no longer exist? This is the hidden tragedy of Thera. The loss that can't be measured in broken pottery or buried buildings. When the island exploded, it took with it not just physical structures, but an entire way of seeing the world. A unique perspective that had been shaped by 1,000 years of life in a volcanic environment. The Therans had developed cultural practices, artistic traditions, and spiritual beliefs that were perfectly adapted to their specific place on Earth. When that place vanished, much of what made Theran culture unique vanished with it. And yet the core of their civilization survived because it wasn't built on geography alone. It was built on ideas, on values, on ways of understanding what it means to be human in a world of overwhelming forces. The sophistication that had allowed them to create indoor plumbing and 3-story buildings also allowed them to adapt to new environments. The artistic sensitivity that had produced their magnificent frescoes found new expression in new landscapes. The social cooperation that had made their evacuation possible served them well as they integrated into foreign communities. Most remarkably, they maintained their identity even as they adapted to new circumstances. In settlements across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have found evidence of communities that preserved distinctly Theran characteristics while adopting local customs and technologies. These weren't refugees who simply assimilated and disappeared into the broader population. They were cultural ambassadors. People who enriched their new homes while maintaining connections to their lost origins. This process of cultural transmission and adaptation had consequences that rippled through centuries. The artistic techniques that Theran craftsmen brought to their new homes influenced local traditions, creating hybrid styles that combined Theran sophistication with regional preferences. The trading networks that Theran merchants re-established in exile helped restore commercial connections that had been disrupted by the eruption. The religious practices that Theran priests maintained in foreign temples contributed to the complex syncretic spirituality that characterized the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. But perhaps most significantly, the Theran diaspora carried with them a hard-won understanding of impermanence that would profoundly influence how later civilizations thought about their relationship with the natural world. They had lived through the ultimate reminder that nothing human beings build is permanent, that the most successful civilizations exist at the mercy of forces beyond their control or understanding. This wisdom, born from catastrophic loss, became part of the intellectual DNA of the ancient Mediterranean world. You can trace its influence through Greek philosophy, Roman literature, and the religious traditions that would eventually give rise to Christianity and Islam. The idea that human pride must be balanced with humility, that prosperity must be tempered with awareness of its fragility, that the things we love most are often the things we're most likely to lose. These concepts didn't emerge from abstract philosophical speculation. They were forged in the lived experience of people who had watched their paradise become hell in a single day. The story of Thera also forced later civilizations to grapple with questions about divine justice and natural disaster that remain relevant today. If the Therans had been good people, sophisticated people, people who had found ways to live in apparent harmony with their environment, why had they suffered such complete destruction? What did it mean that their very success, their prosperity built around the volcano they celebrated, had made them vulnerable to the forces they celebrated? These weren't abstract theological questions for the survivors and their descendants. They were urgent practical concerns that shaped how people thought about urban planning, risk assessment, and the proper relationship between human ambition and natural forces. The memory of Thera became a cautionary tale that influenced everything from where cities were built to how rulers understood their responsibilities to their people. But the influence of Thera extended beyond philosophy and urban planning into the realm of art and imagination. The story of a great civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day proved irresistible to storytellers across the ancient world. We can trace elements of the Theran catastrophe through myths and legends from dozens of different cultures, each one adapted to local traditions and concerns, but all carrying echoes of that original trauma. The most famous of these adaptations is, of course, Plato's Atlantis, but the Theran influence can be found in stories from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Egyptian texts speak of islands that vanished beneath the waves. Mesopotamian myths describe great floods that swept away entire civilizations. Even in the biblical tradition, scholars have found possible connections between the Thera eruption and stories of divine judgment expressed through natural disasters. What's remarkable about all these stories is how they preserve not just the fact of catastrophic destruction, but the emotional truth of what such destruction means for the people who survive it. They capture the sense of loss, the struggle to understand how such things can happen, the challenge of rebuilding not just physical communities, but spiritual and cultural foundations that have been shaken to their core. The Therans who lived through their civilization's destruction became the authors of a new chapter in human understanding. A chapter written not in books, but in the lived experience of exile, adaptation, and eventual renewal. They proved that civilizations, like individuals, can survive even the most complete disasters if they retain the essential qualities that made them worth preserving in the first place. Their story reminds us that what we think of as permanent is often temporary, that what we consider secure is frequently vulnerable, and that the foundations of our world rest on forces we neither fully understand nor control. But it also reminds us that human creativity, human adaptability, and human resilience can survive even the most overwhelming catastrophes. The frescoes of Akrotiri, preserved under volcanic ash for over 3 millennia, still glow with color when archaeologists uncover them. The dolphins still seem to leap, the flowers still seem to bloom, the young athletes still seem ready to compete. Time stopped for these images on the day the eruption buried them, but the vision they represent, the human capacity to create beauty and meaning in an uncertain world, that vision has never stopped moving forward. Today, as we face our own environmental challenges, our own questions about humanity's relationship with natural forces, the story of Thera offers both warning and hope. It reminds us that the Earth operates on scales that dwarf human planning, that the forces that sustain us can also destroy us, that prosperity built without acknowledging natural limits is inherently fragile. But it also shows us that human beings have faced absolute catastrophe before and survived, not just physically but culturally, carrying forward the best of what they had created and using it to build something new. The Therans who evacuated their doomed island didn't just save their lives. They saved their civilization's essential spirit, its commitment to beauty and sophistication and human dignity, and they planted seeds of that spirit in communities across the known world. The volcano that destroyed their city couldn't destroy their ideas, their skills, their understanding of what it means to live fully in an uncertain world. Those intangible treasures, more precious than any gold or bronze they might have carried into exile, became part of humanity's permanent inheritance. When we look at the ruins of Akrotiri today, we're not just looking at the remains of a Bronze Age city. We're looking at evidence of human resilience, human creativity, and human wisdom tested by the ultimate trial and proven worthy of preservation. The city that worshipped a volcano teaches us that love and catastrophe often come from the same source, that the things we depend on most are often the things that pose the greatest risk, and that true civilization isn't measured by its ability to avoid disaster, but by its capacity to carry forward what matters most when disaster inevitably comes. This is the gift that Thera gives to the modern world, not just the archaeological treasures buried in its ash, not just the artistic masterpieces preserved in its ruins, but the living example of a people who faced the unimaginable and emerged with their humanity intact, ready to begin again with wisdom earned through loss and hope tempered by experience. In the decades following the eruption, something extraordinary began to happen across the Mediterranean world. As archaeologists piece together the evidence from this period, they are uncovering a story that's almost as remarkable as the original catastrophe itself. The scattered Theran refugees didn't simply disappear into the populations that sheltered them. Instead, they became catalysts for a cultural renaissance that would reshape the ancient world in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Picture a Theran master craftsman arriving at a Cretan palace, his few possessions carefully packed, but his head filled with techniques and traditions that had been perfected over centuries of island life. He doesn't just seek employment, he becomes a teacher, sharing methods of fresco painting that had never been seen outside his homeland. Within a generation, Cretan art begins to show unmistakably Theran influences, but transformed, adapted, made new through the fusion of different cultural traditions. This process repeated itself in dozens of communities across the region. In Egypt, Theran merchants who had once traded along established routes now had to rebuild their networks from scratch. But they brought with them an understanding of Mediterranean commerce that was unmatched in its sophistication. Egyptian records from this period show a sudden increase in trade with the Aegean, new types of goods appearing in marketplaces, new techniques for manufacturing pottery and metalwork. What's fascinating is how these cultural exchanges weren't one-sided. The Therans who settled in foreign lands didn't just give. They also received learned adapted. A Theran priest establishing new religious practices in a Syrian temple didn't simply recreate the rituals of his homeland. He blended them with local traditions, creating hybrid ceremonies that spoke to both his own spiritual needs and the religious sensibilities of his new community. The result was an explosion of innovation across the Eastern Mediterranean. Art styles that had remained relatively static for centuries suddenly began evolving rapidly. Religious practices became more complex and cosmopolitan. Trade networks expanded and became more sophisticated. Technological knowledge spread faster than ever before, as displaced craftsmen shared their expertise with new audiences eager to learn. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about their place in the world. Before Thera, Mediterranean civilizations had been largely regional affairs. The Minoans dominated the Aegean. The Egyptians controlled the Nile. Various Canaanite peoples managed the Levantine coast. There was trade between these regions, certainly, but each maintained its own distinct cultural identity with relatively little mixing. The Theran diaspora changed that forever. Suddenly, there were people in every major Mediterranean community who had direct personal experience of other cultures, other ways of organizing society, other approaches to art and religion and daily life. They became living bridges between civilizations, translating not just languages but entire worldviews. This cultural cross-pollination accelerated after the immediate crisis of the eruption passed, and communities began to stabilize. Theran refugees who had initially been grateful simply to find shelter began to establish themselves as permanent residents, marrying into local families, starting businesses, building temples and workshops that served both their own needs and those of their new neighbors. Their children, born in exile but raised on stories of the lost homeland, became particularly important cultural mediators. They spoke the languages of their new homes fluently, but carried in their hearts the memory of a different way of seeing the world. They became artists and merchants and priests and administrators who could move between different cultural contexts with an ease that their parents' generation had never possessed. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the second generation after the eruption, distinctly hybrid cultures were emerging in communities with significant Theran populations. Pottery styles that combined Theran techniques with local materials and preferences. Religious artifacts that blended Theran symbols with regional deities. Architecture that adapted Theran building methods to different climates and available resources. This wasn't cultural assimilation in the usual sense, where minority populations gradually adopt the practices of the majority until their original identity disappears. Instead, it was something more complex and ultimately more creative. a genuine fusion that created new forms of cultural expression that were neither purely Theran nor purely local, but something entirely new. The impact of this cultural mixing extended far beyond the immediate communities where Theran refugees settled. Trade networks carried new ideas along with new goods. Diplomatic marriages between ruling families spread artistic and religious innovations across political boundaries. Military alliances brought different cultural traditions into contact on campaign and in garrison towns. Within a century of the eruption, you could travel from Egypt to Anatolia and find recognizable elements of Theran influence everywhere, but always transformed, always adapted to local conditions and preferences. A religious symbol that had once decorated a temple wall in Akrotiri might appear on a bronze mirror in Cyprus, but modified to incorporate local divine attributes. A pottery technique that had been developed to work with volcanic clay might be adapted to use river silt, producing vessels that were unmistakably influenced by Theran methods but perfectly suited to their new environment. This process of cultural adaptation and innovation had profound political consequences as well. The old Bronze Age world had been relatively static, with established powers maintaining their positions through military might and control of trade routes. The disruption caused by the Thera eruption created opportunities for new players to enter the game. The Mycenaeans, who had previously been relatively minor players in Mediterranean politics, suddenly found themselves positioned to take advantage of the chaos. They had the military organization to fill the power vacuum left by the damaged Minoan civilization, but they also had something equally important. They had welcomed Theran refugees and learned from them. Mycenaean palaces from the period immediately following the eruption show clear evidence of Theran influence. Their administrative systems become more sophisticated, borrowing organizational methods that had been developed to manage complex island trade networks. Their artistic production increases dramatically, incorporating techniques and styles that had been perfected in Theran workshops. Most importantly, their approach to international relations becomes more nuanced, reflecting an understanding of Mediterranean politics that could only have come from people who had personally participated in that wider world. This pattern repeated itself across the region. Local powers that successfully integrated Theran refugees and learned from their expertise found themselves with significant advantages over those that didn't. They had access to more advanced technologies, more sophisticated artistic traditions, more extensive trade networks, and crucially more nuanced understanding of how to navigate the complex political landscape of the post-eruption Mediterranean. The result was a fundamental reshuffling of power relationships that would define the region for centuries. The Bronze Age world that emerged from the ashes of Thera was more interconnected, more cosmopolitan, and more culturally diverse than anything that had existed before. It was also more volatile, as the old stable hierarchies gave way to a more fluid system where cultural innovation and adaptability could be as important as military strength or resource control. But the most remarkable aspect of this transformation wasn't political or economic, it was intellectual and spiritual. The shared experience of catastrophe and renewal had created a new way of thinking about human existence that would profoundly influence the development of Western civilization. The Therans who had lived through their civilization's destruction carried with them a unique perspective on the relationship between human achievement and cosmic forces. They had seen firsthand that the most successful societies could be destroyed in a single day, that the forces that create prosperity can also bring devastation, that human plans must always account for possibilities beyond human understanding or control. The story of Thera reminds us that civilizations rise and fall on forces beyond our comprehension, yet human resilience endures. These Bronze Age islanders teach us that true strength lies not in conquering nature, but in learning to dance with it, to adapt when everything familiar crumbles, and to carry forward what matters most when the world itself turns against us. Their legacy lives on in every act of courage, every moment of grace under pressure, every choice to rebuild rather than surrender. What will you carry forward when your own ground begins to shake?